have a question that's multi-part to involve everyone. So, Zach, I'm wondering whether you think there is a fit between algorithms and some of the questions that Pat is identifying that are about how we constitute ourselves, or is it just the wrong enterprise? And then I guess I want to ask Alex whether the mode of inquiry that your paper describes is one of contract and consumption, or is it one of citizenship and participation?
I'm reluctant to give like a trite answer in that I think Pat's talk covered so much ground that I don't know to say like algorithms have a role somewhere. I think I'm sure if you think about very specific cases, like you can come up with some case where there's clear guidance on you could formalize what you should do in certain types of scenarios. What I'm not optimistic about is the idea that these things like you're gonna release like the just algorithm toolkit or something, and then this is going to be like the game genie, like you just plug in. Sorry, it's a 1990s reference, but like you're just gonna, this is gonna be some kind of interface you're just gonna insert between whatever you were doing and the real world, and it's gonna make everything okay. I think also that in most of the cases that I've encountered, like the formalism, to the extent that it gets you somewhere, it doesn't, it sort of punts on I think every formalism we've come up with sort of punts on the most difficult issues. So if you look at like algorithmic approaches to fairness, it's sort of like, what we sort of say is, here's all these different conditions and how you would optimize them. But what it doesn't sort of say is, like, the hard work is actually determining in a given setting which is the thing that you should be pushing for, which is the way you should be pushing the needle. Same with like causal approaches to fairness, to say, if someone has done the work of telling you what is a permissible versus impermissible mechanism, but like the hard work is actually in articulating those, not in the algorithm,
So answer the second question that you raised.
Hold the mic closer to your mouth.
Sure. So the way that we were going about this starts with the premise that the legal system does not offer us enough guidance, at least in our understanding thereof, to produce an algorithmic system or an algorithm-assisted decision-making system that actually provides meaningful accountability or meaningful transparency in the sense that might be understood by the individuals who are affected. So I think these ideas of contract law and of the legal standards that we've just discussed, they're extremely relevant when you're thinking about what is the recourse. So if someone has actually been wronged by a system, if a system isn't operating as intended, I think it's very relevant to have these frameworks and to have contracts and to understand, like, in what sense is an algorithm an actor and of what kind. But the sorts of questions that we were asking and this participatory framework that we adopted was to try to get some sense of governance or design kind of from the ground up. So rather than having these governance standards imposed from the top down, like really looking at a very specific context, we don't claim that our results are going to generalize beyond the specific county where we were experimenting and has some specific characteristics, such as that the specialists are actually familiar with algorithmic systems in ways that others may not be. And I think that the specific community in which these systems are deployed and their acceptance of the system as designed and hearing their voice in the original design and development of the system is relevant, and that's something that I don't think the law really is going to provide us with sufficient guidance on, because it needs to cover a much more general case than what we are considering.
Any other comments and questions for each other?
I wanted to ask, could you just say the last part of what you said before, because I may have misunderstood, but...
Yeah, so the last point that I was trying to make is that we are working in a very kind of specific and specialized context where the specific concerns of those affected and those who we're trying to draw into the participatory design framework, those concerns may not be already articulated in the law. So there may be some kind of recourse, like if there's a contract in place and the system's supposed to operate a certain way and those expectations are violated, right? Perhaps there's recourse in the law. But the law as it stands is not providing us with full guidance on, for instance, which features or how, like which features should be used by the model, how they are communicated, kind of the interpersonal communications, the decision-making framework. That is all something that's important to the design process, but isn't something that's going to be kind of dictated by legal standards because there are many compliant formulations.
And I guess I wonder, there is a system for child removal, or,
Yes.
there is. And so it sounds like what you're more referring to is almost like product feedback or focus group testing of a platform. And so I'm sometimes confused because at one point I actually thought you were talking about.
Excuse me, your mic is switched off.
Oh, sorry. Because there is a way in which the language almost sounds like what you're doing is having them participate in almost, that resembles almost like a voting system on whether or not this is going to be put in place as a regulation, which is, I would think, a process that ought to be within a governance system or has to be weighed against or has to be within the system of governance that is not just about contract or whether the product works, but it's a larger feature of the county governance.
I mean,
it's
that's
something
why I asked, is it asking people as if they were consumers or asking people as if they were citizens? And I just have to say, probably the hardest legal work I've ever done in my life is representing kids in child custody matters. And I'm not exaggerating to say I went from that to work on Civil War because it was less terrible. And to have a parent, as I've had, say to me, just wait till you have a child of your own and you'll understand what you're doing and how horrible this is. And that's haunted me my whole life as a parent. I can only say that it seems not in the realm of consumer. It seems something more fundamental about personhood and constitutions.
Because consumer law really is designed for situations in which freedoms, child removal, criminal consequences are not at stake. And so when you move into that realm, the idea that you would, or the company, would have the ultimate say in what gets done or not it feels violative of what government structures we do have. And that's what worries me.
So if I may just clarify, we are not proposing that these systems will make ultimate decisions about the separation of children from families. What we are largely thinking about is how to better target limited services to individuals or families who would benefit most from their provision. And now this involves decisions that may, of course, inadvertently result in the removal of children. But
Inadvertently.
Yes. So inadvertently, in the sense that, for instance, through so there's existing research that suggests that equally situated Black and white families, when a caseworker shows up to investigate, the Black family is much more likely to have the child removed, and the white family is much more likely to be offered services. So even if the intention is initially to risk stratify families into, for instance, a bin that would most likely benefit most from services, that isn't necessarily the action that will result at the end of the day.
But why is that inadvertent? I mean, that is precisely the question of accountability of a system in law for which there are pathways of recourse, supposedly. Mm-hmm. And so, to some degree, the Comfort Board strikes me as being a vote against a decision-making by one entity as opposed to the traditional system, however flawed, that says it's not inadvertent, it's part of the system, let's talk about the system. And that's, possibly a difference between saying, well, anyway, I don't, am I,
It might be an offline
Fine
question,
conversation. I mean, I very much like your intuition that merely translating the algorithm into some kind of comprehensible English is not going to solve the communication problem. That sounds exactly right. But I suspect it's in part because the communication problem is part of a bigger problem.
One more from the panel, and then we'll take from them.
I guess to flip it around and ask a question of Pat and Martha. I guess like a question vis-a-vis I'm interested to hear from the legal perspective about the governance of the tools. I think there's a somewhat belief, I guess, from the tech side that in some sense machine learning poses, or the use of certain kinds of technologies in this family pose like a certain new kind of threat, in that it's there's a question of, is the technology sort of emerging in such a sort of like diversity of application settings and with such a speed that this poses a problem for existing law, which usually moves on perhaps a different time scale to keep up with it, or like is that perception, which I think I've heard before. Sherry, like, do you feel that that's accurate, or do you feel like having actually lived in the law and not just in the context of machine learning, do you feel like this is something that we've encountered things like this, and like the existing mechanisms and the existing pace of legislation is such that the law can keep up with sort of having a coherent way of sort of regulating applications of this technology?
I don't think that anything is new under the sun, if that's what you mean. I mean, I do think that the use of predictive profiling is why there's, again, formally, as somebody said this morning, it's illegal to profile. It's illegal, but it seems to be brought back in by using metrics that place a value on prediction for prediction's sake. And that's in contrast with a standard that, by and large, supposedly looks at the individual in the present moment in a variety, that is shorn of associations, is shorn of lineage. That's not what my understanding of these metrics do. And it's you look, for example, the Boston Police Department has a series of metrics it used to decide who's in a gang or not, and that goes into algorithms, and it includes, what your classmates are doing, what colors you're wearing, whether or not you've, what school you've gone to. There's certainly a lot of suspicion that many of these algorithms are based on where you live, what your parents did. I mean, particularly the child removal. It's what your parents did. How many contacts with social services you've had in your family, not just you. So you can be born into a family with this, and that already is a certain numerical value. So the critique is not simply about the algorithms, it's about the same use of information that perhaps individuals are doing that people distrust the system itself. My concern is that it bakes it in at a much more efficient level, and because so many, not everything, are proprietary, or even if public, are we really going to protest it any more than we did in the world as it was before? If you assume that everybody is going to do this anyway, that's another way of saying you are innately, inherently incapable of being a full human being, a full citizen, and so that's the larger concern I have.
Martha, do you have?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's related very much to what Pat just said. I think your question is a really fundamental one, and I think that there are three ways in which this moment seems somewhat different than prior moments. One is that maybe it's simply a matter of degree rather than kind, that there's an emphasis on prediction rather than retrospective evaluation. And maybe lawyers and society, we've kidded ourselves that it's always been prediction. We're predicting whether or not this person who's testifying in court is more likely to be telling the truth. But is that in the future? It tends to be in the present. It's about them in the past. I don't know. I mean, we at least have told ourselves that we are making decisions about actual events that occurred in the world and what's the right judgment about what happens rather than predictions about what will happen in the future. That's one, and maybe it's just a more stripped down version of something that always goes on, but it is really stripped down. The second is a kind of outsourcing to experts, and that's not the first time that's happened. I worked for a judge who very much wanted to change the criminal justice system, and he thought the way to do it was to give much more room for psychological testimony. And so he defined the insanity defense so broad that it could include economic disadvantage, stress, community experiences. And after 4 years of living under that regime and seeing the experts testify with more and more abstruse labels and taking the power away from the judges by having the labels, he reversed the decision and said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. And this was a judge who wanted to bring in much more factual experience. And that had nothing to do with algorithms, but it had to do with outsourcing to outside the legal system, to other expertise that's less accessible to a democratic accountability. And that seems, not unprecedented, but it is on steroids with algorithms. And then the third dimension that does seem to me somewhat different is that the algorithmic turn allows a bypassing of human institutions. So just think about LinkedIn allows employers to look directly at the picture and the names of people. We know from Sendel's and others' work what the problem is with that. When the law says you're not supposed to be taking certain characteristics into account, we can identify over and over again. Uber's whole business model is to bypass regulations. So there's a bypassing of the regulatory and institutional regimes, and that seems new because there's self-execution. So that seems unprecedented.
Great. Okay. First question from the audience. Can the panel talk about governance of algorithms defined incentives in both private contracts or public decision-making? What are the dangers of allowing incentivization? What should we be looking for? What should be disallowed? Any takers?
Sort of a clarification of precisely what is meant here by incentivization.
I'm the messenger.
When an algorithm is making an allocation decision or making a guidance to a judge or something like that, you might say that, as you were mentioning, that because people are affected by this, they might change their behavior in accordance with the way that the decision is occurring. And I was wondering whether, obviously this must come up in existing governance sort of structures, and I was wondering what is deemed permissible to be incentivized, when, or how should we think about what we should worry about when we think about algorithmic incentives?
There's certainly the Chinese credit system, which I referred earlier, or somebody else referred earlier, which is comprehensive, and many of you are probably more familiar with this than I, but you can't leave, if it looks at everything from the time you are in kindergarten, all your report cards, it gathers data on every citizen, whether you've jaywalked, whether you've committed a larger crime, your family associations, it puts it all and gives it a score, a little bit like a credit score, a financial credit score that we use in the United States, and we seem to be maturing toward that system. The incentives that they build in are, for example, you won't get a bus pass out of your province if you haven't paid a particular debt. So it automatically kicks into, without any sense of due process, it pushes you one way or the other. It norms certain behaviors without a sense of, that is, in my mind, the definition of what totalitarian or totalism, a certain kind of totalism is, that it directs you in ways that. At Columbia, we have this system of a Canvas system with which many people are familiar. And they were training him, I looked up and they had a board in which they ranked the entire faculty. And I said, what's that? And it's actually the conversations that students are having while you're talking. But it ranks faculty by the number of communications during the course of a lecture that students are having. Yes, well, but it's an abstraction of myself. You know, they could be talking about the color of my dress, but it is taken, it's interpreted as a reflection on the interest that I'm generating rather than the boringness of what I'm generating. But, pardon me?
If they talk more, it's supposed to be better.
If they talk more, it's supposed to be better. And then,
So
again,
if they're
that
spellbound,
gets
you're
translated.
screwed.
Yeah, and I know, that's what, I mean, and I'm somebody who actually tells my students to shut their
it,
computers and turn off so we can actually engage. So I'm actually hurting myself by this metric. And so I'm being normed, that's a kind of incentive, I'm being normed by this machine because that's what, you know, my salary or my merit pay will be ultimately judged by. So I mean, I think there are intimate ways of imagining what this.
I'd want to know about incentives for whom. So, you know, put aside algorithms, the introduction of managerial judging, where there's a manager in the court system who will tell each individual judge, you're behind your colleagues, you are taking longer. A lot of people react badly to that because they say, oh, it's turning judging into a factory kind of activity. On the other hand, if you've been on the receiving end of a judge who sat on your judgment for 2 or 3 years, it's pretty horrible. The first rule of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure is the meta rule about how to interpret all the other rules, and it says all of these rules shall be interpreted to advance the just, speedy, and efficient administration of justice. Well, I don't know about you, but they point in opposite directions. And so incentives for the people in the system is one question. Of course, then there's incentives for people who are producing the algorithms, and those are very different.
I think if I could just that I think like one thing that's lost in the kind of like statistical or associational just kind of attempts to formalize fairness is something that's like I think when we talk about people being fair in their decision making is quite fundamental, which is like something I guess something more like procedural fairness or having you're making decisions based on relevant. Like there's not a notion of relevance. When you have a purely statistical framework, you have it's associated or not, and then we add to that, is it protected or not? But like what's missing is that when you make a decision on some basis that is completely besides the point, like especially in the sense of, were you to change it, you would not, like, if you make a hiring decision based on someone's like sartorial choices, that's sort of problematic, among other reasons that like, if someone were to change their shirt or something, like this doesn't make them a fundamentally more or less skilled employee, but now you've sort of imposed in this person's life that now they have to dress a certain way. And so then now, it's like if you make decisions based on what movies someone watches, or, people, there's this idea in the big data, it's like, well, there's signal in it. If we just throw in all the data, we can make better predictions. And you can, but the problem is that now people have to, what happens next is now all these people have to live their lives differently to optimize their outcomes. And you end up intervening into all these aspects of people's lives in ways that really are besides the point. Like, so, and I think there's like a fundamentally, just something fundamentally ethically problematic about that.
Can I just ask, so Martha, about what you said, so if there's a judge, okay, and you know, because you've seen a lot of his court cases, that he likes women with blonde hair, okay, so you send, I don't know, I watch a lot of his TV shows, so you send a lawyer or something like this, so that is not very transparent, but it's some sort of incentivizing of how to behave a certain way. So isn't it better that it's transparent?
Yes. So Shafi asks, isn't it true that litigators pay attention to what a particular judge likes and the appearance of those who are appearing in their court, and isn't that also an incentive? Yeah, but those are bad, and we try to restrict those.
That's what I'm saying, in the algorithm, this is transparent.
So at least it's, yeah.
It could be made transparent, but Brian Stevenson, he gave a wonderful talk that I think is on tape with Sarah Lewis's Vision and Justice.
Yes.
And at the very end, he talks about a 14-year-old client he had who had been hauled in. And it's a very moving story. I forget what he'd even been accused of. It was something very serious. But he was wrongly, it was sort of like the Central Park Five.
He was killing his stepfather.
And,
yeah.
and there was very little evidence, but his whole demeanor was not the sort of thing that was going to please anybody. And the first night he's in there, when Brian Stevenson comes to talk to his client, he can't talk, he won't talk. And of course, in some systems, this would mean that he is recalcitrant or aggressive or sullen. And the lawyer keeps pressing and pressing and pressing until finally this kid bursts into tears. He'd been raped 14 times that night, something like that. And every metric of this kid who was raised in poverty, whose stepfather, I guess, had actually killed had actually committed the murder. But at that time, at that moment, this kid had horrible life chances by any metric, algorithmic or otherwise. Brian Stevenson stepped in, took this kid under his wing, followed him, got him the evidence. I mean, it took resources and care. And now this kid is
doing okay.
He's graduated from college. He's some sort of engineer. He is, and he calls Brian every month to say, "I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay." Yeah. With an algorithmic system, those are the cases that this kid would probably still be in jail. And with a bad judge, this kid would still be in jail. But it also speaks to the power of the exceptionalism that human interaction enables that algorithms may not, and that's my concern.
So let's step outside the court system. I think the development of digitally available legal information is an advance for humanity. And to lower the costs of people who aren't lawyers to have access to legal information, not to mention for lawyers. And that includes AI-powered systems where people can have queries and can navigate systems. I mean, I'm on the board of the national organization that funds legal services for poor people, and our only hope is that we're going to be able to use some AI-powered systems because we're never going to have lawyers for all the poor people who need it. But what worries me is, and I think Zach put it very well, is the decision making. Is that when you turn to these capacities to actually exercise power over people's lives. That's more worrisome to me.
I mean, just one more thing, building upon
Is your mic on?
I think so. What Pat said specifically. As we switch to more algorithmic systems, or at least more algorithmic ways of assessing things and put things on that standard, as opposed to reflecting back on the standards that have existed before this algorithmic wave came along, we wind up pushing our considerations and our dialogue to quantities or elements of the decision process that are more readily quantifiable. And this surely changes incentives. And a lot of the things that matter in these processes are not easily quantifiable things. And so if now the contest becomes, here's my metric for success of an algorithm, and I'm going to assess human decisions by that same standard, I think a lot is lost. And we lose a lot of the social values that we wish to imbue in these systems simply because our quantification does not allow us to articulate those elements.
Okay, I'm going to give Helen the last word / question because we need to end on time because one of the panelists has to go.
Thanks a lot. My question was too inchoate to write on a piece of paper, but hopefully it'll be meaningful. And it's something that Zach kind of raised, but actually it also came up, I think, in Jonathan Kahn's talk yesterday about how formalism is good and it creates efficiencies, but oftentimes there's kind of a remainder. And I mean, this is crass, but if you think about the way Facebook uses the concept friend, the problem, and I think this gets a little bit to both what Martha and what Pat said. So it's standardly now we accept these different modes of governance, and one of them is tech. I mean, I would like to expand it and rather talk about artifact as a regulator, but tech being within that. And to say that I think it's dangerous to put all these four side by side as if like there's this, and this, because what often is happening in tech and getting to Zach's concerns, and now to Pat, is that we have to reduce. So instead of having a human, you've got a profile. And we have these massive systems, and I use behavioral advertising as one of these, where we require humans to be, and I've been giving talks with this concept, machine readable, in order for the system to work. But you're using a very reduced notion of the human in order for the human to be machine readable in the system. But nevertheless, as you mentioned, the machine is making decisions about this machine-readable human, and humans have to accept this machine readability, because if you reject it, you're out of the system completely. And that's also not great. And so I think, I don't know, my question is, are we going to be able to escape this? Can we look at these systems and say, they're viewing us in a very partial way, they're making decisions about us, it's very dangerous. Efficiency, which is the name of the game, is not the only value that we need to be concerned about. So it's really kind of, is there a way out of it, and do you see yourselves in this picture?
Well, it may be crude, but as I mentioned before, I think that there's a kind of standard list for liberal democracies about what is good governance. And efficiency is one of 7 elements. And it may cut in the opposite direction of some of the others, where participation and efficiency are certainly not consistent. The problem with socialism is too many meetings. And responsive and inclusive, and having a sense of complying with the rule of law. Well, the rule of law is more than a set of rules. It's a set of norms and attitudes and institutions. So being legible to a machine may produce some improvements if the comparison is the Department of Motor Vehicles, where I don't know what your experience is, but mine has been pretty awful. So it's all compared to what? But where there are important issues in people's lives, being treated as a human being, as a distinct person, as someone with dignity, as a person who can participate, as a person whose inclusion matters, who is constitutive of the enterprise, that I don't think we've been able to do yet.
I had this experience of going into a doctor's office because I'm at the age where they start looking at my bones, and and my wonderful doctor, who usually talks to me face to face, all of a sudden his head was obscured. There was no eye contact. He was behind a black box, and he was reading the scan of my bone density thing, and his head popped up. He said, "Well, actually, I can't get a result for you." And literally, the machine does not recognize my bones. And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, I think it's because you're African American." And so I said, "Well, okay, for this purpose, why don't you just register me as white?" And so I did this sort of technical passing for purposes of the machine. But of course, it didn't read me because it didn't have enough data on African Americans for whatever reason. This is all correctable, certainly, I'm sure. But there's a way in which the perhaps lower probability of African American women having osteoporosis became a switch of doesn't or does. It became an either or. It became a binary. Now, the other thing is that nobody ever asked me what I was. And so even though it was within the machine as self-reported African American, it's very clear that somebody in the front office or the nurse or the doctor just put in black. But there was no questioning about, and my doctor, who was a fine doctor of many years, would have asked me the basic questions. Yeah. Does your mother have osteoporosis? As my mother does. What's your family history? All of that was substituted by the deference. So literally the expertise of the doctor, it wasn't that the judge couldn't make his own decision. There was an automatic deference by virtue of the structure of the way in which the black box is on his desk, between his head and mine. I mean, it's literally there physically blocking our view. And so I suppose the correction would be, we need more data, you need to refine it, you need to ask more questions, all of that, so I can be legible by this machine. But I'm not sure that's the answer, because I'm not sure again, it is the question of read by whom and for what purpose. And I'll just end with the story of being, a place where I go very frequently, which is way off in the wilds of Washington State, way up the Hood Canal. It's very quiet. It's a place where, old growth trees, and I can lie in the trees and look up and feel, I think there's a German word for this feeling, Waldeinsamkeit, which is, the feeling of being in the forest without any sense. There's a sense of the sky, and you're close to nature. It's a feeling you don't get anyplace else. You can leave your body in some sense. You can absolutely forget who you are. So there's almost a sense of self-melting into the surroundings in this way that isn't somebody always looking at you. Well, recently, they apparently put a camera in the trees. That's what they put a camera in the trees to apparently look for people who are invading upon fishing grounds or going to be poaching salmon. And so all of a sudden, it changed my relationship. I can't relax in the woods anymore, and not in those woods. And there are very few places on the planet where that sense of not being monitored. And it isn't that I'm doing anything wrong, but it affected my whole sense of relation to the environment, to the ecology. And I think that that's a quality that we're losing, even when the algorithms are entirely right.
Well, I would like a world where the doctor has a handheld device and so is able to talk to you and can ask the questions, and also has engaged in enough rigorous education to not be deferring to a machine and to the algorithms, but treats it as assistance and maybe is having more time to have actual conversation with you. And I think we could imagine something like that in law, but we are so far from that, because money and saving time, it's just much, much more dominant in the way that the incentive structure currently works.
Yeah, and I think Helen's question is like a fundamental one. It's sort of so expansive. It's hard to just sort of restate it, make sure I sort of am on the same page. Right? I think there was addressing both the ways in which the way we are represented within these technical systems is extremely sort of reductive, and then the ways in which our values, like sort of express our values vis-a-vis like how these systems should operate, is also itself somewhat reductive. And there's a question of, will it get better, or do we have a way of opting out or bettering our position within it? And I guess I don't have I guess if I had a satisfying answer to that, I would, feel more accomplished than I do. But I don't have a satisfying answer. I don't know. I think a lot hinges on who holds power and what their incentives are. Like to the extent that we're represented in a way that is richer or in a way that benefits us more, like who this is sort of and I guess in terms of opting out, like I had a sort of related experience that I spent the last month in Taiwan, and I tried to kick some of my dependence on my cell phone and technology for some of that time, and among other things I discovered, it was there are certain things that you are I felt a certain kind of existential fright that there are a whole set of services that you're sort of denied access to if you don't participate. You can't get on the high-speed rail without, you can't kick the cell phone and take the high-speed rail because the ticket that you bought on your computer cannot be accessed without having a cell phone for the QR code at the station. And so, there's a certain way that these systems are created in a way that, with maybe no individual central actor making this decision, it's sort of almost impossible to opt out of so many of these systems. So I guess, I don't have any great answers, and we're all going to die.
I just want to comment before we close the panel that, yes, the representation of an individual is reductive, but all representations of individuals are reductive. A human's understanding of you is also reductive. And so I think I'll just close with that observation. And there may even be more information.
I think the individuals reduced, but the values are
And that's a different, you're absolutely right.
And it's the fairness.
Yeah.
You were saying we're never going to be able to ultimately get fairness or justice or privacy in a machine, through a formalism. And I was picking up on both those things. I'm sorry. Okay, finished. But I wanted
I
to
didn't
not-
give you the mic.
Yeah, I didn't want to just say the human is reduced. I'm saying that sometimes in the interest of formalism, the value itself.
That's absolutely true, but I happen to be fascinated with the other topic, so I thought I would mention it.
And I also think that, that's why privacy is so important, because there is something violative about always being seen. And it's precisely because even a person gazing at me is reductive. And sometimes it's just nice to retreat, to beyond gaze. And the architecture of what we're setting up never permits, what historically was the realm of privacy, but it's also a realm of certain kinds of human flourishing, which includes normative violations like creativity and innovation and reinvention and self-determination. So,
So first, let's thank the panelists. I think that the schedule has a break on it. Can someone tell me for how long? And while you're looking that up, I'll put I'll seed the board with a couple of topics for small discussion groups, and we have the break